Craig Dutton read the first paragraph, set the page face down on the counter, and fed it into the office shredder before Roy Fenwick had finished his second sentence. The machine hummed for 3 seconds. The paper came out the other end in strips. Roy watched the last corner disappear and did not move his hands from the edge of the counter. Craig said the complaint described a private business disagreement and that municipal licensing didn't take those. He said it in the flat, efficient tone of someone who had delivered the same sentence enough times that it no longer required thinking. Then he asked whether Roy needed anything else. Roy looked at the shredder. He looked at Craig, and he said, in the same quiet voice he'd used since walking through the door 20 minutes earlier, "Make sure you remember this morning." Craig told him the counter closed at 4. The lobby of Moorfield City Hall smelled like carpet cleaner and printer toner. The chairs along the far wall were the stackable kind, orange, with a scratch down the back of every third one from where someone had dragged them across the tile once and never bothered to repaint. Roy had counted the scratches while he waited. He did things like that without meaning to. Counted, measured, noted details in the background of rooms while the main event played out in front of him. It was a habit from 30 years in building inspection. You developed an eye for the thing nobody wanted you to see. He had come to the counter alone. No lawyer, no city councilor waiting outside in an SUV. He wore a canvas jacket with a frayed cuff on the left side and a pair of work boots that had dried mud on the right toe from the walkway outside Greta Szabo's building. He'd noticed it in the parking lot and decided to leave it. He wanted to look like exactly what the people behind that counter assumed he was. A man in his late 50s with a grievance nobody was going to do anything about. He had left his credentials in the glove compartment of his truck. That was a decision he'd made on the drive over, and it was the decision he would spend the next 3 months defending. Greta Szabo had run a food truck off the corner of Elgin and 5th for 41 years. Pierogies and cabbage rolls and, on Fridays in the summer, a beet soup she'd been making from the same recipe since she was 17. Half the city knew her by her first name. The other half knew her as the woman with the yellow umbrella, because she'd always kept one bolted to the left side of the truck for the lineup in case of rain, and she had repainted it the same shade of yellow every 2 years without fail. Her food truck permit had been revoked on a Tuesday in February, without warning, without an explanation beyond a single letter that referenced a bylaw violation she had never been cited for. 3 weeks before the revocation, 2 men from a company called Meridian Advisory Group had stopped by the truck during the lunch rush. They'd introduced themselves as consultants who specialized in regulatory compliance for small food vendors. They explained that the licensing environment in Moorfield was getting complicated, that permit renewals were being scrutinized more closely than before, and that for an annual retainer of $8,000, Meridian could ensure her paperwork stayed clean. Greta had asked what exactly that meant. One of the men had smiled and said it meant peace of mind. She'd told them she wasn't interested. They said they understood, left a card on the truck window, and said they might stop by again. The permit revocation letter came 18 days later. She had come to Roy because he lived 4 buildings down, and because she trusted him more than she trusted a lawyer she didn't know. She'd sat at his kitchen table for an hour explaining what had happened, and he had listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he had asked her 3 questions, none of which she could fully answer. Then he'd told her he'd take her complaint in himself. He hadn't told her why he was the right person to ask. She hadn't asked. The complaint had been 2 pages. Greta had signed it at his kitchen table with a ballpoint pen she kept borrowing to fix the letters when her hand shook. The signature came out tilted and she'd apologized for it. He told her the signature was fine. Back at the licensing counter, Craig had moved to his terminal and was typing with the performative busyness of someone who has declared a conversation finished. Roy did not leave. He asked whether the shredding of a formal complaint was itself a reportable action, and if so, who received the report. He asked whether complaint intake was logged by the clerk or by the system, and whether refusals at the counter generated an automatic file reference. Craig stopped typing. The questions were not complicated. That was the problem with them. They were the kind of questions with a specific and well-known answer, And the only person who asked them was someone who already knew what that answer was. Paula Neef came out of the back office because Craig had turned his chair enough that she could see his expression through the glass partition. She was the division supervisor, mid-50s, with the particular manner of someone who had managed the same small office long enough to treat its policies as personal positions. She told Roy that her clerk had explained the situation and that the division's decision stood. Roy let her finish. Then he mentioned Project Kestrel. He said the name the way someone might reference a meeting they'd assumed was common knowledge, not asking, referencing it, in passing, as context for something else. Paula's expression didn't change, but she looked at Craig for 1 second before looking back at Roy, and the look was the kind that passes between people who share something they haven't told anyone else. There was no Project Kestrel. Roy had invented the name on the drive over. It meant nothing. It had never been said aloud before that moment, and it had only one purpose. Paula told him the conversation was finished and asked him to step away from the counter. A young security guard who clearly did not enjoy the parts of his job that required him to remove people walked Roy out through the front doors. Roy crossed the parking lot, got into his truck, and sat with the engine off. His phone showed 38 minutes remaining. That was the time Margaret Holbrook had given him. She was the provincial ombudsman, and she was currently on the Trans-Canada with 2 investigators from her office, a digital forensics specialist from the Ministry of Justice, and a senior legal advisor from the Attorney General's team. The estimate was 38 minutes, give or take, depending on a construction slowdown on the 401. Roy could have walked back in. He could have shown his credentials and stopped everything that was about to happen inside that building. He chose not to, for the same reason he'd left them in the glove compartment to begin with. Destroying one complaint was bad enough. The paper trail from a single act of misconduct was manageable for a city union, but the window between a civilian walking out and the ombudsman arriving was 38 minutes, and whatever got done in that window was not a mistake. It was a decision. Decisions left traces. He put the phone face up on the dash and waited. Inside, Craig called Paula into the back office before the door had finished closing. He said the man had known things he shouldn't have known, that the questions had not been random, that something wasn't right. Paula told him to check the visitor log for a name, delete the shredding record from the daily intake log, because there was no complaint to attach it to anyway, and to call the main number at Meridian and let them know someone had come in asking questions. Craig found the number on a sticky note he'd kept on his monitor for the last 2 years. A junior clerk named Devin Hatch was at the photocopier when Paula said the last part. He did not look up. He made his copies and walked back to his desk and set them in the wrong file because he wasn't paying attention to what he was carrying anymore. 22 minutes later, Roy's phone vibrated once. He got out of the truck. Margaret Holbrook walked through the main entrance of Moorfield City Hall 4 minutes after Roy came back through the side doors. She was 61 years old, compact, and carried herself with the kind of unhurried authority that has no need to announce itself. She wore her provincial ombudsman's identification on a lanyard she didn't bother tucking away. The 2 investigators behind her carried equipment bags. The forensics specialist, a man named Trent Haber, had a laptop case under each arm. Roy met them in the lobby and said nothing to the security guard who started to approach. Margaret showed her identification and asked to speak to the director of municipal licensing. The guard made a call. They waited 2 minutes. Then they went upstairs. Brian Thorpe had been director of licensing for 11 years. He was polished in the way that municipal administrators become polished when nobody above them pays close attention, smooth at meetings, correct on paper, careful about which conversations he had in writing and which he had standing in hallways. He'd built the office around himself over the years the way a man arranges furniture, gradually, without anyone noticing, until the room felt like it had always been that way. When Margaret introduced Roy by his full title, Special Integrity Advisor to the Provincial Ombudsman, appointed under Regulation 19 of the Ombudsman Act, assigned to this district under a confidential deployment protocol, Brian's face cycled through 3 things and settled on none of them. He said he hadn't been informed of any deployment. Margaret said that was the point. The office was sealed within the hour. Trent and his colleague went to Craig's workstation first, then Paula's, imaging both terminals before either could be touched again. The intake log showed a deletion at 2:47 p.m. The timestamp was 11 minutes after Roy had left the counter. What took longer was the shared network drive. Every city hall had one, a mapped drive where staff filed documents that didn't fit the formal records management system. This one was visible to anyone in the division. Inside it was a folder called Admin MISC that hadn't been touched in a records audit since the system migration 4 years earlier. Because the migration had assigned it a legacy path that the automated audit software didn't recognize as a standard directory. Inside Admin MISC, inside a subfolder called Backups Old, was a spreadsheet. Trent opened it on a secured drive and turned the screen toward Roy without saying anything. It took Roy about 90 seconds to understand what he was looking at. Every business that had received a visit from Meridian Advisory Group over the past 4 years was listed by name, address, and permit file number. Beside each name was a column labeled status. The entries read, pending, renewed, declined, or escalated. Businesses marked declined had refused to pay Meridian's retainer. Businesses marked escalated had, in the weeks following their refusal, received bylaw complaints, unscheduled inspections, or permit flags they had never had before. Greta Szabo's food truck was listed. Her status read declined. The note beside her name said, coordinated lapse, licensing. The date beside that note was 4 days before her permit revocation letter had been sent. Roy read it twice. Then he set the laptop on Brian's credenza, where Brian could see it from where he was sitting. There were 83 names on the spreadsheet. Roy told Margaret and Trent to leave the drive connected and monitored. Everything had already been imaged twice to isolated drives, both copies in the hands of the legal advisor before anyone went home that evening. But the live file stayed live. Someone had been updating it from outside the office, and a spreadsheet that goes quiet tells its owner something. A spreadsheet still open on the network tells him nothing at all. Roy wanted whoever was updating it to reach for it. Devin Hatch had been watching all of it from his desk across the office. By 5 o'clock, he had understood that whatever he had heard Paula say about calling Meridian was not something he wanted to have heard. He thought about it during the drive home. He thought about it through most of the evening. By the next morning, he had made a decision, and the decision was to talk. He knocked on Roy's temporary office, a borrowed room off the main boardroom, and stood in the doorway for a moment. He was 26 and had been in the clerk position for just over a year, and he knew without anyone telling him that he had done something wrong the day before by not speaking. He didn't try to frame it any other way. He told Roy that permit files for businesses that had refused Meridian's offer tended to develop problems within about 3 weeks. The problems never looked coordinated. An unscheduled safety inspection here, a bylaw citation there, a flag that sent the renewal into secondary review. They came from different departments. They never arrived all at once. And if you only looked at one file at a time, none of it pointed anywhere specific. Roy asked him who had shown him that pattern. Devin said a previous clerk had mentioned it, casually, as an orientation to how the office worked. Then he said the thing he had actually come to say. He had seen Brian call someone the previous afternoon while Trent was still upstairs imaging the terminals. Not on his desk phone, on a mobile Brian kept in his jacket pocket, a phone Devin had never seen him use for anything else. Roy asked Devin whether he could describe the jacket. Devin said it was charcoal gray with a silver zip, and that Brian wore it on days when he didn't expect meetings. That afternoon, Roy went back to the spreadsheet with Trent and pulled the access history on the file. The last external modification had been 3 days before Roy's visit to the counter. The account that had made the modification was a guest credential, generated through an admin pathway, visible only in the legacy directory log that the automated audit software had never been able to read. The credential had been created by Devin's predecessor. There were 68 entries in the access history, and they lined up, date by date, with the escalated interventions against businesses that had told Meridian no. The complication came from the union. Craig had filed a workplace complaint by the end of the first week, and it was 14 pages. It said Roy had entered a municipal office without disclosing his role, had deliberately provoked a clerk into a procedural error, and had abused his appointment by directing an investigation into staff who had personally wronged him. It named Roy 4 times in the first 2 pages and Brian 0 times. The complaint didn't touch the spreadsheet, which told Roy more than the 14 pages said. The union's legal team filed an injunction application asking that Roy be removed from any oversight role connected to the Moorfield Licensing Division pending a hearing. Margaret and the AG's advisor met for 40 minutes on a Thursday and issued a written decision the following morning. Roy Fenwick was removed from the Moorfield licensing investigation, effective immediately. His access to the division's systems was revoked. He was to have no further contact with division staff. Roy turned in his access card. He asked Margaret one question: whether the spreadsheet and all image drives remained under sealed custody. She said yes. That was all either of them said about it in the building. Brian happened to be in the corridor when Roy came out. He was standing near the water fountain in a position that had no other explanation at that hour of the afternoon. He said, very quietly, that the Ombudsman's office had a reputation for overreach and that this was a good example of why that reputation existed. Roy walked past him without answering. That evening, in a coffee shop on King Street that was not close to City Hall and had no municipal employees in it, Roy met with Margaret and the legal advisor and said what had not been said in the building. The removal was real and had been filed through every proper channel. Brian's union would find it entirely legitimate, 'cause it was. It had also been decided between Margaret, the AG's office, and Roy 9 days earlier in this same coffee shop on the night the access history had first been pulled. Brian had to believe the investigation had stalled. A man who believed he was still under active scrutiny would keep his people frightened and close and make no moves. A man who believed the scrutiny had been redirected by the very union complaint he'd quietly encouraged would feel the ground shift under him and reach for the thing he wanted to protect. Roy was appointed as special consultant to the AG's office under a separate instrument that evening. The appointment was not announced. His authority over the evidence chain was restored in a different system, in a different building, where Brian had no standing and no contacts. He needed Brian to write something down. Roy prepared 3 separate documents. Each described the same thing: the recovery of a backup copy of the shared spreadsheet from an external server. Each document was complete, plausible, and internally consistent, and each went to exactly one person. Devon received a version that named the backup as the Fernwood file. Devon's predecessor, now working in the city's transit division, received a version that named it the Clearwater file. A record supervisor who had been in the licensing division for 6 years received a version that named it the Ashton file. None of those names existed. There was no backup, no external server, no Fernwood or Clearwater or Ashton. The words had one purpose: to travel and to arrive somewhere carrying proof of the route they had taken. He gave it 2 days. It took 1. The message went to Brian's personal phone, the charcoal jacket phone, in the late morning. It came from a number that traced back to a prepaid device, and that same number had appeared twice in the access history over the previous year. The message said, "What did they find?" The reply took 7 minutes. Fernwood. Get to it before Thursday. Roy read the message in the AG's office and sat with it for a moment. Devon had been told the Fernwood name. Devon, who had knocked on Roy's door and explained everything he'd seen, had been reporting to Brian's contact number, almost certainly because someone had told him it was the version of events where he came out the other side intact. The second message was worse than the first. It said, if anything's left on it, say it was Devon's project. He was the one maintaining the admin folder anyway. Roy read that part twice. A director ordering the destruction of evidence in writing was one thing. Selecting in the same breath which of his own people would carry the blame for it was another. The hearing was held in a municipal boardroom with a single camera mounted in the ceiling corner. Brian arrived early and walked the perimeter of the room. He checked the camera housing. He asked the union representative to confirm it was inactive. He asked the AG's legal counsel whether any recording was being made. Counsel said no recording device had been installed in the room, which was accurate. Roy was already seated. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he'd worn to the licensing counter. The button on the left breast pocket transmitted to a receiver in the AG's office 3 floors below, and had been doing so since he'd put the jacket on that morning. Brian opened well. He was measured, thorough, and he built his argument around Roy the same way Craig's complaint had. Not around the spreadsheet, not around the 83 business names, not around Meridian, around Roy, the man who had concealed his role, the man who had provoked the very misconduct he'd used to justify the investigation, the man who could not be both victim and investigator. Roy let him finish every sentence. Then Margaret set a sealed folder in the center of the table and began. She stated that the imaged drives from the division terminals were authenticated under an unbroken chain of custody, hash-matched at every transfer point, and had been in sealed storage since the day they were pulled. She called Trent to walk through the spreadsheet. 83 businesses, 4 years of coordinated permit interference, 68 access entries traced to a guest credential, the credential traced to a specific admin pathway, the pathway traced to Brian's archived login records. Brian's pen stopped moving when Trent said the number 68. Then Margaret asked Devon to place his personal phone on the table. Devon set it down without looking across the room. His counsel had spent 3 days telling him not to. He had spent 3 days understanding that the message existed in the AG's evidence file, whether he produced it or not, and that the only question left was which side of it he'd be standing on when it was read aloud. The exchange went into the record line by line, the question, the single word, Fernwood, the instruction to get to it before Thursday, the instruction to put it on Devon. Brian said the messages had been fabricated. Margaret answered that the carrier metadata had been acquired under a warrant signed 4 days before the message was ever sent, that the AG's office had held it from the beginning, and that the record existed entirely independently of anything Devon had chosen to hand over. Devon spoke next. He said he had passed information from the investigation to Brian's contact number 6 times over 3 weeks, because he had been told by someone he trusted that cooperating with Brian was what would protect him. He said he had been wrong about what protection meant. He said the Fernwood name had reached Brian from him, and he was not going to say otherwise. A record supervisor named Willa Goss set a printed page on the table. It was a printout she had made on the first morning, before Trent had come upstairs, of the spreadsheet entry path and the last modified timestamp. She had folded it twice and kept it in her desk drawer for 3 weeks because she had not known what to do with it and could not stop thinking about it. She said she had brought it because she needed it not to exist only in a drawer. Brian attacked all 3 of them in the final 20 minutes. He named what Devon had done, named what Willa had done by retaining a document outside the formal evidence chain, named what Devon's predecessor had done by maintaining an unauthorized filing path for years. 3 witnesses, he said, who each had a reason to cooperate and a history that made their cooperation look like self-protection. Roy didn't defend any of them. He said it plainly, into a room where each of them was close enough to hear every word. Devon had passed information to a person who was using him, and that was real and it had consequences. Willa had retained a document outside proper procedure, and that too would be noted. Devon's predecessor had built a filing pathway that existed outside the city's records system, and whatever explanation existed for that, it didn't change what the pathway had been used for. None of that converted the evidence into fiction. A message ordering the destruction of records was not a fabrication, because the person who received it had also done something wrong. A spreadsheet linking permit interference to Meridian retainer payments was not less accurate because the directory it lived in was improperly maintained. A guest credential accessed 68 times didn't belong to someone else, because the person who created it had done so under instructions she'd later decided were harmless. Everyone in this room can have done something they shouldn't have, Roy said. That has never once meant the rest of it didn't happen. Brian had nowhere left to take it. Margaret stood up from her chair along the wall and crossed to the head of the table, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when someone's with that particular kind of purpose. She named what was to happen. Brian Thorpe was relieved of his position as Director of Municipal Licensing, effective immediately. His access credentials, department devices, and administrative authorizations were to be surrendered to the investigators present. The matter was being referred to the provincial prosecutor's office for consideration of charges relating to breach of trust, obstruction, and conspiracy to defraud. Brian looked at Margaret. Then he looked at the camera housing he had personally confirmed was empty. Then he looked at the button on Roy's jacket pocket, and something changed in his expression when he finally understood what it was and how long it had been there. Roy met his eyes. Every second you take is being recorded too. Brian took off his city ID and set it on the table. He took the charcoal jacket phone out of his pocket and set it beside the ID. He set down his department tablet, the plastic access fob for the building's secure floors. There was nothing on Roy's face when he watched it happen. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a steady attention, the same kind he'd had at the licensing counter when the shredder hummed for 3 seconds and the last corner of Greta's complaint went through. "You didn't lose this today," Roy said. "You spent the last 4 years trading it away, one permit file at a time. Every time you made someone decide that asking for help wasn't worth the trouble." The rest of it moved quickly because it had been prepared for weeks in places Brian hadn't known existed. Meridian Advisory Group's accounts were frozen by the end of that same afternoon. Provincial investigators executed warrants at the company's offices and at 3 residential addresses connected to its principals. Financial records came out in boxes. The audio recordings Meridian had kept internally from their sales visits, apparently as quality control documentation, turned out to contain 31 instances of the same offer being made in the same words to small business owners across the city. Within 6 weeks, investigators had established that more than $200,000 had been paid to Meridian under consulting agreements not one of the paying businesses had ever sought. Craig was terminated and referred for professional conduct review. Paula was suspended pending a full investigation of her role in the intake deletion. Devin received a formal reprimand and was placed on administrative reassignment. His cooperation was entered into the record, and it did not clear his conduct. Willa went through the standard review process without asking to be treated differently. Brian was charged 3 months later. Nobody walked away clean for having eventually told the truth. Roy made sure of it, and he did not apologize to anyone for doing so. A week after the hearing, Roy drove 6 blocks from City Hall to the corner of Elgin and 5th. It was a Saturday morning in early March, cold and bright, with that particular quality of late winter light that makes everything in southern Ontario look like it has been cleaned overnight. Greta Szabo had her truck open. The yellow umbrella was bolted back to the left side. He sat at one of the folding tables she kept on the sidewalk and waited. She came around the side of the truck when she saw him, and he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a permit renewal confirmation printed that morning, carrying a file number, an issue date, and the name of the clerk who had processed it. Greta read it. She read it again. She asked him whether it still meant anything, now that everything else had already been dealt with. He told her what he believed to be true. It meant her permit existed. It meant it carried a number. It meant that anyone who went looking for it in the city's record system would find it there, with her name on it, and no one in that building could make it go away. She folded it and tucked it into the front pocket of her apron, the same way she'd been tucking things into that pocket for 40 years. Then she went back around the truck and brought him a bowl of beet soup, which she had been making since she was 17, and did not charge him for it. 4 months later, Roy came back to the Moorfield City Hall licensing counter on an ordinary Wednesday. He wore the same canvas jacket. His credentials stayed in his inside pocket. He didn't take them out. At the counter, a man in a concrete-dusted work shirt was setting a folder down on the laminate. He had driven in from a job site and had grease on his left hand and didn't seem to think anything of it. He didn't know the right person to call. He hadn't looked up who to ask for in advance. He just had a complaint about a permit delay that had stopped his crew from finishing a job, and he wanted someone to write it down. Willa Goss was behind the terminal. She had been assigned to front counter work during the reorganization, and she had asked to stay when the reorganization was over. She took the folder. She read it carefully. She entered it into the intake system, scanned every page, generated a file number, printed a receipt, and handed it across the counter. She told the man to keep the receipt somewhere he could find it. He folded it into his chest pocket, thanked her, and left. Margaret Holbrook was standing at the edge of the lobby. She had come down to walk through the new intake protocols with the interim director and had finished early. She and Roy stood together and watched the man push through the front doors into the parking lot. Roy raised a hand to stop two staff members who had started to stand from their chairs at the far end of the lobby. He shook his head. They sat back down. He nodded toward the counter, where the next person in line was already setting their papers down. "There's only one test for any of this," he said. "Not whether the right person gets helped. Whether the wrong person, the one nobody's waiting on, the one with mud on his boot and no appointment, walks out of here with the same thing in his hand as everyone else. That's the only version of this job that's actually the job." Margaret said nothing, but she stayed in the lobby until the counter had processed 3 more people, all of them strangers. None of them watched.